Aha, the light bulb goes on. All that stuff about evolution is true, but God did it. Now, at the time, I thought that was an original idea. You can tell how young I was. I found out since it's a very common idea, sometimes called theistic evolution, sometimes called progressive creation. And it seemed to fit perfectly. I could go to church on Sunday and believe everything in the Bible. I could go back to class on Monday and still teach my students all the old examples of evolution I'd been forced to learn. It seemed like the easy way out. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized those two are really opposites of one another. I think a lot of people, we all admit there are a lot of people who somehow try to put the Bible and evolution together, and I think they, like me, have a false, romanticized idea about what evolution is all about. You may think of evolution as step-by-step, upward, onward progress. Well, that sounds like something God might do. But the evolutionary process, as the evolutionists envision it, is something quite different from what a lot of people imagine. Here's the way Darwin put it in the summary paragraphs of his Origin of Species. Thus, from the war of nature, famine and death, the war of nature, famine and death, the production of higher animals directly follows. Even the evolution of cooperation can only proceed over the dead bodies of those who don't cooperate. And natural selection is a struggle for survival among the offspring, brothers and sisters, the offspring of the same litter. Only some of those genes can survive to the next generation, or there is no evolution at all, except for a constant death, 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 death. And I began to think, does that sound like a way God would create the world all very good? This is the God who in Genesis 6 tells us he was grieved to his heart at the violence and corruption that filled the earth after man's fall or plunge into sin. Well, if God was grieved to his heart at violence and death and struggle and corruption, why would he use violence, death, struggle, and corruption as his means of creation? It didn't seem to fit. Why would Christ come to conquer death if death was God's way of making evolution happen? It would mean that Christ's coming wouldn't have any meaning at all. And it's not just a matter of a few verses. The idea of evolution is the total opposite of the whole gospel message. And I began to worry about that. By the way, this is what evolutionists still believe. Every once in a while, Carl Sagan makes the cover of Time magazine or Parade magazine or something like that. Always interesting, not always correct, but always interesting. And he put it this way: how did we as human beings get here? Only through an immense number of deaths. Death and accident, death and accident, death and accident over millions of years are you and I, brains and all, here today. And I saw that, it just didn't add up. Jacques Monod, famous atheist, once put it this way: he was surprised that any Christian would believe that God would use such a cruel, wasteful, and inefficient process as evolution for his means of creation. Well, as clear and simple as that is, I'm not sure I could have gotten myself out of that theistic evolution trap on my own. The good news is what? God doesn't expect us to do it all on our own. He sent some help. Well, help came to me in the form of the new biologist hired at the college. Now, this time the Christian college made a mistake and hired a fellow who was already a Christian, already a creationist. And he showed up at my home with a very famous or infamous book, depending on your point of view, The Genesis Flood by Drs. Whitcomb and Morris. And Alan Davis wanted to read through this book with me, and show me some of the problems in evolution, the evidence of creation. We read a few paragraphs together. I got all upset and angry and irate. Don't these people know anything? Don't they know this? Don't they know that? And I threw all my evolutionary arguments at me, And Alan got me calmed down. We tried another few paragraphs. Same thing, just mad and throwing evolution questions and comments at them. Little did I know the Lord was beginning to prepare me for this ministry. Well, after finally Alan said, well, maybe you ought to read that book on your own, and we'll talk about it when you're done with it. And so I read the rest of that book. Of course, later on, I worked for Dr. Morris. I never had the courage to show him the nasty notes I wrote on the early pages of his book. But by the time I'd finished, I'd begun to feel cheated. Why had no one ever pointed out to me the problems in evolution, the evidence of creation? Well, there's a funny phrase, isn't it? Evidence of creation. Even many Christians think, well, evidence, that's something else. Creation's something you believe or you don't believe. It's a matter of faith. We really don't talk about evidence of creation. Well, may I suggest to you that nothing is really easier and more natural than scientists and just ordinary people in finding and recognizing evidence of creation. Many of you have had an experience like this, walking along a little creek bed or so on, and finding a pebble or something like that, some little stone that may have some appearance of design. I remember my daughter finding a little stone that looked like a little Dutch wooden shoe in miniature. But as I rolled it around in my hand, I could see that the lines of wear in the rock followed lines of weakness in the rock. The softer minerals were worn away faster than the harder minerals. In spite of some appearance of design, that tumbled pebble was just the result of time, chance, and continuing natural processes. Well, as an evolutionist, that's what I was teaching my students, that you're like that tumbled pebble. You're a result simply of time, chance, and the natural processes like mutation and the struggle for survival. But many of you, especially in this area, have had the experience of finding an arrowhead along a creek bed or in a plowed field or something like that. And there you see the chip marks go with and against the grain of the rock. The softer mineral, harder minerals are cut through equally. When you look at something as simple as an arrowhead, no working parts, still you recognize evidence of creation, matter shaped and molded by a plan that gives it a special purpose. What do you need to recognize evidence of creation? Answer: the ordinary tools of science, logic and observation. That's all you need, the ordinary tools of science, logic and observation. They're simply patterns of order in our universe that tell us they're not a result of time, chance, and chemistry, but plan, purpose, and special acts of creation. You know who understands that? Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan is an evolutionist, but he knows you can recognize evidence of creation in nature directly. He had convinced the American government to spend several $1 million on SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, as Ken was telling you about it. Well, now the government, in one of their first good moves, I guess, abandoned that project and so on, but they're looking for private funding now. But why? Because he knows you can tell the difference between signals sent with deliberate intent, coded information, and just random background produced by nuclear fusion in stars and things like that. When we landed on Mars, Sagan was convinced, Mars had been there as long as the Earth, had passed through the right temperature even before the Earth had, and life was just a result of time, chance, and chemistry. He knew there had to be life on Mars if there was any truth in evolution. So he said, never mind the little scoops that dig for things. When the cameras scan the Martian landscape, there'll be something looking back at them. Well, as you know, we landed on Mars, couldn't even find an organic molecule. The place was absolutely sterile. And he decided that maybe life was a little harder to make than he had imagined. But suppose they'd found just one little bit of pottery, just a piece of pottery, just a broken handle of a cup. Everybody would have said, wow, there's creative intelligence on Mars. Maybe they died out. Maybe they colonized the Earth. But just looking at something as simple as a pebble or an arrowhead, you recognize creative intelligence, even if it's not earthly intelligence. Even if it was on Mars, even if it was outer space, what? Even if it was before the foundations of the earth, that transcendent creator God. Am I saying anything unusual? Not at all. That's what Paul tells us in Romans 1. The invisible things of God are clearly seen in all the things that have been made. How clearly? So that people are without excuse for not recognizing that evidence. You might say, well, if the evidence is that clear, why isn't everybody a creationist? The answer is everybody is a creationist. You'll never meet anybody who's not a creationist. You'll only meet people who are happy about it, like Ken and I, and people who are unhappy about it. What do they do? What I did before I became a Christian. Evidence. I don't see any evidence. Suppressing the truth, as we see in Romans 1. Suppressing the truth, holding it down, knowing it's there. Who's the maddest and the angriest at God? The atheist, Madeline Murray O'Hare. You don't get that angry at somebody who doesn't exist, but she knows he's there and hates him with every fiber of her being. And so we can find and recognize our evidence of creation.